why you shouldn't be intimidated by them, even though they are all enormous. Hello Tandem fandom, I'm Jenny and I'm back with another video. So I'm kind of reintroducing myself a little bit today. I'm going to be taken over as your fantasy correspondent, and I thought I would just kind of introduce a little bit on what I like in fantasy. I have been a fantasy reader pretty much my whole life. A typical kind of reading journey. As a kid, read a lot of fantasy. There was, lots of magical elves and hobbits. There were wizard schools, and there were things like Greek gods and Hunger Games and things like that, quite typical young teenage reading from like the 90s. When I kind of started to grow up and when I went to uni, I studied English literature and I ended up reading a lot of classics and actually literary fiction when I was at uni. After uni, I stopped reading for a while, and I kind of got back into reading in about 2015, where again it was classics, literary fiction and historical fiction that kind of like got me back into reading, which is very weird. If anyone who kind of knows me now and you're like, who are you? I don't read classics or literary fiction at all anymore, and it is very rare now for me to pick up a historical, but that's what I was reading when I kind of got back into reading. That then moved kind of into thrillers, contemporary, and then I picked up fantasy again and I was like, yes, this is where I am. So I've always read a wide range of genres, but fantasy is a genre that kind of has always had a special place in my heart, and fantasy is still to this day my biggest read genre. Now, I know that not everybody is a fantasy reader, and I asked some of the team about this because not everybody on Team Tandem reads fantasy. And the main reasons that people were saying of why they're not fantasy readers is, first of all, the books are really, really big. Fair comment. Number two, the world building is kind of confusing. I'll take it. I don't agree, but I'll take it. And number three, they're all series, and series are really, really intimidating. So I'm here today to tell you about 5 of my favourite fantasy series and why you shouldn't be intimidated by them, even though they are all enormous. So we're going to start off with the author that kind of got me into what I call modern fantasy. So you'll know what I mean when I get onto it, but the fantasy that you see now on BookTok, on Bookstagram, on booktube. And that author is J Maas. Now I'm talking about Throne of Glass today. I'm not talking about the ACOTAR series, which I think is a very, very accessible series anyway. Throne of Glass to me feels more high fantasy. And high fantasy is something that I really, really enjoy. High fantasy, if you don't know, is typically going to be sort of using magic, having magic systems, having different kind of creatures involved. Whereas like your low fantasy is more just kind of normal people, but in a different world, a made up world, or having very, very kind of like basic magic. So for me, Throne of Glass is more high fantasy. And I love it. This series I absolutely adore. It is an 8-book series. And while this book is a very pleasant 400 odd pages, the books do get quite a bit bigger until the final book in the series, Kingdom of Ash, it's over 900 pages. But we won't say that too loudly because that's quite scary. But the reason why I'm going to say that Throne of Glass is not a scary series to get into is I think it is very, very accessible. So first of all, it is a YA series. And YA is a great entry point to fantasy, in my opinion, because first of all, the world building is slightly kind of tighter. You don't have a huge expansive world building. If you think something like Lord of the Rings, where there are pages upon pages of descriptions of a tree, nah, you don't get any of that. The world building is quite, I don't want to say simple, but it's quite easy to understand. Pacing in YA fantasy typically is quite fast. So again, you can get through the story quickly. And I think that is all true in Throne of Glass. It's very fast paced. The world is very, very easy to understand. But what I love with this series is the world and the magic that starts off quite small in Throne of Glass. Except Throne of Glass really isn't high fantasy at all. There isn't really any magic in here at all. It is the story of a assassin in a fight, kind of trials to the death of who is going to be the king's assassin. There isn't really any magic in there. There aren't really any like magical creatures. It's a made-up world, but that's it. But as the series progresses, we meet creatures, so we meet things like fae and witches and dragons. Our world gets bigger, so both through going to different cities, different countries, different continents, and that all means that you end up growing with this world. You're developing your understanding of the world naturally as the book and the series progresses, rather than being told all of this big world information in book one. You're getting it gradually. And I think that's just an absolutely fantastic way to tell a story. So yeah, Throne of Glass, I would say yes, it is an 8-book series. Yes, the last book is very big, but it is very accessible, particularly if you are new to fantasy. So the second series that I'm going to talk about is one which is our first of our expansive universes. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that in a minute. So that is The Shadowhunters by Cassandra Clare. Now, why I think that this is a really great accessible fantasy. Again, it is YA. This is set in our world. So this is set in kind of modern day New York, circa late 2000s, 2010-ish. And this follows a group of shadow hunters. They are your half angel demon fighters. So there are demons, there are warlocks, there are vampires, there are werewolves in this world. But again, the world building isn't super complicated because it's set in New York City. So we don't need to tell you what New York City looks like. Where shadow hunters can be very intimidating is, as it currently stands, it's 5 trilogies, 4 or 5 collections of short stories, a 6th unfinished trilogy, and Cassandra Clare is still writing stuff in this world. So you kind of look at the extensive amount of Shadowhunters books, and that can be incredibly off-putting because there's just so much. But what I'm here to say is that that's a really good thing, because this isn't actually a 21-book series that you need to work your whole way through. Not at all. It's a collection of trilogies in the same world. So the most common starting point is City of Bones. This one follows Jason Clary. So you've got 3 books, like I said, set in modern day New York. The other kind of typical starting point would be going in chronological order. So starting with Clockwork Angel. This is set in Victorian London, and we're following Will, Tessa and Jem, who again are shadow hunters. So the stories are connected in terms of they're all about the same group of people. They're all about shadow hunters, but they are separated by about 150, 200 years. So it means that you can read just this trilogy, just the 3 books here, and you can be done with it. Or you can have read this trilogy and then read this trilogy and then go back and read the second half of this series, and then pick up this series which follows the children from this one, and then pick up this trilogy which follows people who we mentioned in the end of this one. They are all connected, but they're also all separate. It is just one big world, and you're kind of getting stories from all over the place, which I think is a really great way to get really immersed in a big, expansive fantasy world without it being super intimidating, because you do not need to read everything. You can just read 3 books. And again, with Cassandra Clare, her, as you can see from this stack, her word count is not necessarily the shortest. City of Bones here is probably the shortest book in this pile, and again this one is about 450 pages. Most of these books are over 500 pages, but they are YA, they are incredibly fast paced, and they're very, very easy to read through and to just get yourself absolutely immersed in. So I would recommend the Shadowhunters series if you are wanting to get into fantasy, and I would not be intimidated by it just because of the vast amount of books there are. Split it up, take it trilogy by trilogy. Now, while we're on the subject of immersive worlds and big, kind of expansive universes, we're going to move into adult fantasy, and we're going to talk about again, on the surface, very intimidating 16 book adult fantasy series, which is The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. But again, you don't need to read all 16 books. These are split into 5 series. There are 4 trilogies and a quartet. So you can just read the 3 books and that's it. Now, Robin Hobb is an adult series. Again, I would say this is fairly low magic, low fantasy. We are in a fictional world, so it does plant it firmly in the realms of fantasy, but there's really not any magic in the realm of the Elderlings. Oh, being joined by my cat. But there's not really any magic in the realm of the Elderlings. In the first trilogy, which starts with Assassin's Apprentice, we have a little bit of magic in that one of our main characters can talk to animals, which is amazing. In the second trilogy, which starts with Ship of Magic, we have a little bit of magic in that the ships can come to life. But again, that's about it. You're not going to be faced with complicated spells or magical creatures or really anything like that. The magic in Robin Hobb stories is very, very little, which makes it a nice accessible book if you're not the biggest fan of complicated magic systems and complicated world buildings. I will also say Robin Hobb's books are slow paced. If you want a book, particularly at this time of year as we're getting into the kind of autumn winter months when you just want to be underneath a blanket and reading all day, Robin Hobb is exactly the way to go. These books are made for snuggling down and just immersing yourself in them. As you can tell, they're quite big, but again, these books are incredible. I read Ship of Magic last month and I absolutely loved it to pieces. It's so fantastic. And you just kind of get sucked into this story and into this world. And because it is slow paced, you're really getting to know every single character. You get to know what they want, what their like drive is. So you're not seeing like a really quick snippet and moving on. It's not action, action, action. It's a slow story that just builds and just kind of gives you a really beautiful, rounded world. I would definitely recommend The Realm of the Elderlings if you do want to read more adult fantasy and if you want something that is, again, a kind of slower paced, immersive read. And like I said, with Realm of the Elderlings, you don't need to be intimidated by the books because it's not a 16-book series. It's a trilogy. We can manage 3 books. Yeah, the books are big. So this one, I'm not going to tell you the word count, the page count, but it starts with a 9. But the way that I read these books is I split them up into about 30-page increments, which is roughly like just under a chapter at a time. I can read 30 pages in a day. I can do that. I can sit down and immerse myself and read 30 pages of this book. And by the end of the month, I've read the whole book. And to be totally honest, by the time I've got halfway through, I am so sucked in. Those little tabs telling me that I've got 30 pages to read today, they go out the window and I just binge it. Okay, so my 4th series that looks intimidating but really isn't is another immersive world, an immersive universe, and that is The Cosmere by Brandon Sanderson. So The Cosmere is made up of smaller series. So we've got the Mistborn trilogy, we've got the second era of Mistborn, which is made up of 4 books, we've got a few standalones, and we've got the Stormlight Archives, which currently we've just had the 5th book be released. Well, again, it can look intimidating, especially with the size of these books. Brandon Sanderson is one of the best, if not the best, fantasy author in the world of all time, hands down. I think that's a fair comment. Actually, I'm trying to think if I can contradict myself with that, but there aren't very many fantasy authors who are up there on Brandon Sanderson's level. Now, the Cosmere is a bit more kind of high magic compared to the books that we've spoken about already. So we have got kind of complicated magic systems. We've got brand new worlds that you're learning about. We've got lots of political intrigue. So you've not just got to learn about the world and the magic, but there's the politics in it as well. Now, all of this to me is ticking all of my boxes and I'm going, yes, this sounds incredible. And this is, I think, what makes fantasy such a fantastic genre, is that you're not just getting a small part of a story, you're getting literally something from every single genre. In fantasy books, you'll have elements of romance, you'll have elements of mysteries and crimes, you'll have elements of political intrigue. You'll have just like everyday slice of life kind of contemporary elements. There'll be fantasies that are written in almost like a literary style. So really, if there's any genre that you read and you enjoy, there's probably a fantasy book for you. But what's fantastic with the Cosmere and with Brandon Sanderson, like I said, his world is incredible. And the reason that I have got 3 books here is there are typically 3 main entry points into the Cosmere. So some people will start with this book, Elantris. This is Brandon Sanderson's first novel. It's really, really good, but a lot of people will read it first because it's the first in publication order. I personally have started with Mistborn. So this is the first trilogy that Brandon Sanderson's written, and again, absolutely incredible, outstanding. As you can tell, I tabbed it up a lot. I had a great time reading this book. And the other place where people will start will be Stormlight. So this is Way of Kings Part 1. The books aren't small. That is another Brandon Sanderson thing, is he's not very good at sticking to a word count. The books are big. But Way of Kings and the Stormlight Archive is another very, very accessible entry point into the Cosmere universe. While Brandon Sanderson's books are adult, they are really adult in terms of the fact that they have a very in-depth world building and a very in-depth plot line. They have no raunchiness, there is no swearing. So I know quite a few people who have recommended these to teenagers and younger readers, particularly typically boys who want to see themselves in stories that you don't get a lot of for like teenage boys. A lot will read Brandon Sanderson because again, it is very, very accessible and exciting to read. There is just a big world to get involved in. And now my final recommendation, last but by absolutely no means least, is Game of Thrones by J Martin. Now the thing for me that I think is most intimidating about Game of Thrones isn't the size of the books, isn't the scope of the world, because we've already discussed in the other ones how they are things that we can cope with. For me, the scary thing about Game of Thrones is that it's not finished. And we don't know if and when it will be finished. If we've all watched season 8, we know we want a different ending for the books, please. So Game of Thrones, the books are absolutely incredible. If you are a Game of Thrones TV show fan, you may have read some of the books already. The first couple of books do follow the show quite closely, or I guess the show followed the books quite closely. But as the series continued, they did veer further away from the books. These books, again, start in Game of Thrones with quite a small world. So again, if you've seen the show, in the first book in Game of Thrones, we only really see Winterfell, King's Landing, and we meet Daenerys. So we're only really in about 3 places. As the series continues, that world does expand, which again is absolutely amazing. Just like I was saying with Throne of Glass, you're really getting to understand the world and what's happening, and then it expands and gets bigger. Similarly to Throne of Glass, actually, Game of Thrones has very, very limited magic. You don't have witches and wizards and lots of like spells happening in Game of Thrones. The magic really is there's dragons and there's White Walkers. And that's all of the magic that there really is in Game of Thrones. So again, if you're intimidated by all of like the magic and the having to learn all about these different kind of words and how magical things work, which you will if you read Brandon Sanderson, you don't get that in Game of Thrones. So it is really, really accessible. It also is again a very fun series. There is a lot of blood, a lot of guts, a lot of dead bodies, and they start appearing on page 1. But it is just an absolutely fantastic world to be immersed in. And I'm sure as you are watching a booktube video, I'm sure you also are somebody who believes that books are always going to be better than TV or film. And the books are absolutely, absolutely outstanding. I, like many, many fans, am anxiously waiting for the 6th book in the series to be published. We don't know when that's going to happen. I think it was due in 2015. We're now in 2024. So, you know, we might get it one day. Maybe. Game of Thrones will be a 7-book series. So there are only 2 books left in the series. They're just taking a while to arrive. So yes, Game of Thrones I would say is intimidating because it isn't yet finished. I should also just step back a bit and say the Cosmere also isn't yet finished. However, I have no doubt at all that Brandon Sanderson will finish the series. Brandon Sanderson pumps out at least 1 book a year, and they are all absolutely incredible. And he's finished off other authors' series when they were no longer able to. So I have no doubt that Brandon Sanderson will finish the Cosmere. I have some doubts about whether George R. R. Martin will finish Game of Thrones. So that is it, my list of recommendations on fantasy series that look intimidating, but why you should still read them and why they're not really that scary. If you have got any recommendations for me on big fantasy series that I can get my teeth into, drop them down below, let me know. If you like this video, please leave us a like, subscribe down below, leave me a dragon emoji to let me know that you were here, just because there's dragons in quite a few of these books. We love a dragon. If you want to, get down in the description box, you can see our links to our Instagram, TikTok, and you can sign up to our newsletter to find out all about our read-alongs. Thanks so much. Bye.